I begin this morning realizing that your mileage on that video may vary. Some of you know and are familiar with that song and of what's happening up there. For the rest of you, let me get you there. This song is by a group called Linkin Park. This, as you noticed, normally there's a lead singer. I love this video because it shows the impact. This concert was held after the lead singer, Chester Bennington, lost his battle with depression to suicide. That emptiness is felt. It's really emotional for me because of when I met Linkin Park. When I met Linkin Park, I was in a dark place. I had massive depression, massive negative, evil thoughts all the time. I felt alone. I felt isolated. Metal music was the first place where I felt hope, connection. It's because the artists I was listening to were all saying, "We feel that too. You are not alone." Sorry. Linkin Park was close. You are not alone, and we are not going to let this win. I'm going to share for you the song that made me a Linkin Park fan. Just a few lyrics. It's a song called "Breaking the Habit." I don't know what's worth fighting for, or why I have to scream. I don't know why I instigate and say what I don't mean. I don't know how I got this way. I know it's not all right, so I'm breaking the habit tonight. These words are, yes, these are dark emotions, but they are beatable. Did you see the faces in the crowd singing? This is a message that was received. The legacy that is left behind by Chester is not one of depression. It is one of you can win. Sorry. Why am I bringing up this thing that obviously causes me so much emotional things? It is because the passage we are looking at today is also about legacy. What is being left behind? I'm going to start by reading the passage, and then I want us to explore some of the legacies that we find in here. So beginning, this is Mark 14. It was now 2 days before Passover, and the feast of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were seeking to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. And she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like this? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And so they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing for me. For you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. Jesus has obviously been making quite a commotion. We've seen that as Jamie has preached over the last couple of weeks. He is, in some points, outright attacking the Pharisees for their hypocrisy, for their blindness, for their willful ignorance. This is not something that most people take too kindly. Most people, when they hear this, react the way they are. We need to end this. And they are also terrified of the crowds of people Jesus is gathering. Jesus is so popular with the people that were they to kill him in the street, there would be massive repercussions that they don't want to deal with. So they want it in secret. That is our background of this. The disciples are aware of some of this, maybe not the whole picture, but they are aware that there is religious opposition to Jesus. Let's get down. Let's dig into this first legacy, the legacy of Mary of Bethany. Now, her name did not appear in Mark. It doesn't appear in Matthew. It's only John that outright names her. We're not quite sure why the other two gospel evangelists didn't want to include her specific name. But in looking at the stories, we can tell this is the same event that is happening. And so I've pulled them up. And as we go through this, I want you to know her legacy right up front. Mary of Bethany's legacy is the woman who understood Jesus when the disciples did not and could not. She, a woman who at that time was seen as less than, the overlooked, she saw and understood what the disciples couldn't. We read the Mark passage. We see him emphasizing it's just a woman, but Jesus saying that the purpose of this anointing was for his burial. In Matthew, again, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask full of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. This is the very same setup. Jesus' response, also very similar. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. And again, there's that promise. This story is going to be told in conjunction with the Gospels. John, who, by the way, John, when he is writing his Gospel, it is less an evangelism move and more of a correcting move. The churches he's writing this to are familiar with this story. He gives extra details throughout his gospel. He's correcting bad theology as he's going through and telling the story. John has a vested interest in getting down to some of these details. How does John read it? 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom he had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard. There we get that detail again. This ties it into Mark, also saying the pure nard. And anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with his hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Jesus' response to the opposition against her: leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. To us, it seems like this possibly could be another event because, the other two talked about head, and here John is talking about feet. Actually, the context of how honored guests worked at that time tells us that these two are actually really connected. See, when you had an honored guest come into your home, you did two things. You anointed their head with oil, which was not this big pouring out that she does. It was a little anointing with oil. And you washed their feet. We are familiar with the other big story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Foot washing is what you did. That is part of how you show honor and respect. Here she is pouring a whole thing of oil, anointing, giving it not only is this cultural thing of respect for the honored guest, but it also brings to mind the imagery of the anointing of the kings of Israel, where there would be the oil poured over their head. This is what we see. Wiping the feet with her tears. It is intimate. Jesus sees in her heart, Mary understands what he has been saying. She understands he is a king who is going to die. And that is why he takes that kingly anointing and he says, she has anointed me for burial. Now let's look at the other players in this story. Judas and the disciples. It's very interesting is that Matthew and Mark put the blame on all of the disciples. John goes, we're going to see John goes right ahead and he points the finger at Judas. This is Judas. But Matthew and Mark assign this blame to all of them. I think this means that the other disciples agreed with Judas. Maybe not for the same reason, but we are told time and time again, the disciples did not understand. They did not understand. Judas may have made a good point to them. In Mark, there were some. In Matthew, even more explicit. When the disciples saw it, they were indignant. Let's look at John. John gives us the rest of the story. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Jamie shared a while ago with us, 1 denarii was about a day's wage. This is more money than you would make in an entire year as a laborer if you did not take the Sabbath off. This is a lot of money. He said this not because he cared about the poor. Not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief who had charge of the money bag, and he used it to help himself to what was in it. The other Gospels don't go into that detail, but that has colored how we see Judas. That little detail has brought his legacy into clear focus for us. He was self-centered. He was focused on greed. This parallels that teaching Jesus had. You cannot serve both God and money. Judas was a thief who skimmed off the top. The same thing tax collectors did, who all the zealots decried. Judas is already betraying Jesus and the disciples before the grand betrayal. This is maybe why Judas is synonymous with traitor in our modern language. He embodies this character of the one who betrays. This is the beginning of him setting up that legacy. This thought of legacy gives me 2 thoughts. I don't have a nice acronym like Jamie normally does. I apologize for that. But in exchange, you get just 2 thoughts. The first one is this. A single action can be your legacy. A single action. Mary has 2 notable actions. She probably did a lot more. But what we see with Mary is we have this moment that we just looked at, and the moment where she again shows that she understands what nobody else does when Martha asks Jesus to scold her. Martha says, "I'm doing all the work. Mary's just sitting there with you. Can you, tell her to get off her butt and stop being lazy and, help me out?" Jesus says, "She understands. I will not be here for long. She is where she should be." Here we have, she has seen what you haven't, and she has anointed the king for his death. Mary's legacy can be either one of those actions, a single action. And you'll find as you look at a lot of people with legacies, they're remembered for either a singular action or an encompassing collection of actions that are thought of as a singular action. Maybe the legacy is a company. Maybe the legacy is a story. It can come down to a legacy being set by one single action. Which brings us to the second part. It is possible to change that action, to change what your legacy is. And I have 2 examples, one biblical, one modern. We're going to start with the modern one. I hope you're familiar with Nobel. Immediately in your mind, you think Peace Prize. If you're like 98% of people, Nobel Peace Prize is your first association. Nobel is the inventor of dynamite. He saw his legacy being one of destruction tied to dynamite. And he made a choice to do a bigger action to change his legacy. And it worked for 98% of people. You think Peace Prize. You do not think destructive dynamite. The biblical one I share as well. There are two traitors in the story of the disciples. There are two notable betrayers of Jesus. Judas is the first. Peter is the second. We do not think of Peter as the traitor. When we are referring to traitors and betrayers in our modern language, we do not call them a Peter. We call them a Judas. And that is because Peter's legacy changed. It did not stay with that betrayal. He had remorse. He chose to be reconciled with Jesus. Now, some of us go, well, in John we see that Jesus goes after Peter. That may be so. But Jesus goes after each of us. It is a two-way street. Jesus approaches us with the idea of reconciliation for what wrongs we have done him. We have to also choose reconciliation. That is why we have Judas's legacy as the traitor, and we have Peter's legacy as the rock. The one who stumbled but got back up and became a fighter for Jesus, who helped build the church. That's Peter's legacy. It is not the traitor. It is as the builder, the one in whom Jesus relies and calls the rock. It is possible to change your action. I think we as Christians need sometimes to think about what is the legacy that we are leaving behind. What will people remember us for? And is that a good, God-honoring action, or is it a self-serving action? There is time. If you find yourself with a legacy of me, there is time. You can change that to a legacy of him. It takes prayer and it takes a lot of work. It'll probably take great sacrifice. For Peter, there was great sacrifice. For Nobel, there was great sacrifice. Changing your legacy is not easy, but it is important. We should not obsess on our legacy, but we should from time to time be aware of what are we leaving behind and how will we be remembered.